3 minutes after Catherine's statement hit the wires, the palace did something it almost never does in public view. It panicked behind closed doors, phones lit up in private corridors, senior aides were summoned without explanation, and an emergency meeting was called so quickly that even veteran staff whispered that this was not routine damage control, this was containment. And somewhere far from London, Meghan was caught completely off guard because what she believed was the end of a tense exchange had suddenly escalated into something far more strategic and far more dangerous. The words Catherine released were calm, restrained, devastatingly precise, and they carried that unmistakable tone of finality that had already shaken the narrative days earlier. The same tone that insiders described as closure dressed as composure, and according to the transcript that circulated before everything shifted. The impact was immediate, but what no one expected was the internal response that followed, because while the public debated tone and subtext, inside palace walls something far more calculated was unfolding, something that suggested Catherine's statement was not just an emotional boundary, but a strategic trigger. The emergency meeting was not announced, of course it never is, but cars began arriving through the side entrance, not the ceremonial front, and aides who had not been seen together in months were suddenly seated around the same polished table, their folders thick, their expressions tight, and the agenda reportedly centered on one question: what comes next now that the line has been drawn so publicly and so irreversibly? Because make no mistake, Catherine's statement was not written in haste, it was not reactive, it was not defensive, it was a closing argument delivered without accusation. And that kind of restraint does something profound in royal dynamics. It shifts authority quietly, it solidifies hierarchy without spectacle, and it forces the institution to decide whether to support the boundary or soften it. And this time, according to whispers that slipped through the cracks, the decision was swift. There would be no softening. There would be no follow-up clarification. There would be structural alignment. That is why the meeting mattered. It was not about rewriting Catherine's words. It was about reinforcing them. Senior advisors reportedly discussed protocol adjustments, access recalibrations, communication filters tightening even further, not as punishment, but as procedure. And that distinction is everything, because procedure in royal language is permanence disguised as routine. When something becomes procedural, it becomes almost impossible to reverse without losing face. Meghan, however, did not see this coming. She anticipated backlash, yes. She expected headlines, commentary, emotional reactions she could counter, reshape, reframe. But an emergency meeting that signals consolidation, that was different. That was the palace deciding not just to stand by Catherine, but to build around her position. And when that realization filtered back through private channels, when advisors began noticing that calls were not being returned as quickly, that informal updates had stopped, that familiar intermediaries sounded cautious instead of reassuring, the shift became undeniable. This was no longer a narrative battle. This was institutional realignment. Inside that room, sources suggest one phrase surfaced repeatedly: stability over spectacle. That phrase alone tells you everything. Stability means Catherine. Spectacle, in the unspoken comparison, meant volatility, unpredictability, exposure. And in a monarchy that survives on continuity, the choice was almost predetermined. The emergency meeting was not about drama. It was about insulation. It was about ensuring that whatever emotional aftershocks followed Catherine's words would not fracture the structure she represents. What makes this even more explosive is the timing. The statement had barely settled in the public consciousness when the internal response accelerated. There was no waiting period, no observation phase. It was as if the palace had anticipated the ripple effect and prepared the blueprint in advance, which raises the most uncomfortable question of all. Was the meeting reactive, or was it pre-planned to follow the statement the moment it was released? If it was pre-planned, then Catherine's words were not just personal closure, they were the opening move in a coordinated strategy. And that possibility changes everything. Meghan's camp reportedly learned of the emergency gathering not through formal channels, but through fragmented whispers, the kind that arrive incomplete and unsettling, and when they pieced together that senior figures were aligning behind Catherine rather than moderating her stance, the shock was palpable. Because alignment signals endorsement. Endorsement signals permanence. And permanence closes doors that were once believed to be negotiable. The emotional impact is one layer, yes, but the structural consequences are far heavier. When the palace convenes urgently after a statement that sets boundaries, it is rarely to dilute them. It is to protect them. Protecting a boundary history in royal terms often translates into redefining roles quietly, adjusting expectations subtly, and reinforcing distance without publicly announcing exclusion. It is surgical, it is controlled, and it is extraordinarily difficult to challenge without appearing disruptive. Meanwhile, the public saw only fragments, headlines about composure, commentary about restraint, but behind those headlines was a tightening of internal protocols that signaled something much colder than outrage. It signaled consensus, and consensus within the monarchy is power. The emergency meeting reportedly concluded with no dramatic declarations, no fiery speeches, just a shared understanding that Catherine's position would stand as is, unamended, unsoftened, and that the institution would not engage in further emotional exchange. For Meghan, this development shifts the terrain entirely. Engaging an individual is one thing. Engaging an institution unified around that individual is another. The emergency meeting transformed Catherine's statement from a personal boundary into a structural one. It elevated it from sentiment to policy. And when sentiment becomes policy, the pathway back narrows dramatically. What makes this chapter so gripping is not the volume of conflict, but the absence of it. There were no raised voices, no public rebukes, no retaliatory interviews. There was simply a room, a table, a consensus forming in silence. And that silence may be louder than any confrontation. Because in royal history, the most decisive shifts rarely arrive with thunder. They arrive with calm documentation and procedural adjustments that seem minor until you realize they are permanent. As the meeting adjourned, insiders suggest the mood was not triumphant but resolute. Catherine's composure had forced a choice, and the palace had chosen alignment. Meghan, caught off guard, now faces a reality that feels less like a feud and more like a finalized structure. The emergency meeting was not about fighting back. It was about moving forward without looking back. And that is a far more devastating development than any headline could capture. What happened after that emergency meeting is where the real story begins. Because meetings in the palace are rarely about what is said in the room, they are about what quietly changes once everyone leaves it, and within 48 hours of Catherine's statement being reinforced rather than reconsidered, subtle but unmistakable shifts began surfacing in ways that only those watching closely would recognize as seismic. Invitations that had once remained ambiguous suddenly solidified without certain names attached. Briefing lists were revised with a precision that felt administrative on the surface, yet deeply intentional underneath. And communication protocols that used to allow informal outreach were quietly rerouted through stricter channels, not in a dramatic purge, not in a public severing, but in a methodical narrowing that signaled one thing above all else: the boundary Catherine drew was not symbolic. It was operational. Inside royal circles, operational changes speak louder than public sentiment because they endure beyond headlines, and what insiders describe is not retaliation but insulation, a deliberate reinforcement of continuity that makes disruption nearly impossible to penetrate. And that insulation reportedly includes a recalibration of who represents stability moving forward, who anchors public perception, who embodies the future narrative of endurance rather than emotional volatility. And the answer to that recalibration is painfully obvious. Catherine's composure has become more than personal strength, it has become institutional currency. The emergency meeting did not invent that currency, but it endorsed it, formalized it, and that endorsement carries consequences that ripple far beyond one statement. For Meghan, the shock was not that Catherine held firm, it was that the palace amplified her firmness by doing nothing dramatic at all. There was no counter-briefing war, no tit-for-tat escalation, no subtle undermining to soften the optics. There was simply silence combined with structural reinforcement, and that combination is suffocating because it leaves no clear target to confront. Reports circulating through private advisors suggest that attempts to gauge whether the door remained slightly ajar were met not with hostility but with polite deflection, a tone that says the matter is no longer active without ever declaring it closed, and that ambiguity is its own form of closure because it denies the possibility of negotiation while avoiding the optics of rejection. The most controversial development whispered in corridors is that long-term planning discussions may have accelerated as a result of the statement and the meeting, not in the sense of immediate dramatic changes, but in the strategic positioning of future initiatives, public appearances, and legacy projects that center Catherine more prominently than before, effectively anchoring the monarchy's forward trajectory in her state steadiness. If true, that is not merely a defensive maneuver, it is a forward march. It suggests that rather than being shaken by controversy, the institution has chosen to consolidate around the figure who declined to escalate it, and consolidation changes leverage entirely. Meanwhile, public reaction continues to fracture in unpredictable ways, with some praising Catherine's refusal to engage as a masterclass in restraint and others interpreting it as calculated coldness. Yet what matters more than opinion is momentum, and momentum has subtly shifted from emotional debate to structural observation. People are no longer asking who felt hurt, they are asking who holds influence. And influence in royal dynamics is measured by access, endorsement, and visibility within sanctioned spaces. The emergency meeting, by aligning those elements behind Catherine, may have redrawn that map permanently. There are even murmurs, though unconfirmed and fiercely denied in official terms, that certain collaborative opportunities once considered flexible are being re-examined under a stricter lens, not to exclude out of spite, but to ensure alignment with what insiders call the new clarity. That phrase alone carries weight because clarity in royal language means reduced ambiguity, and reduced ambiguity often translates into fewer gray areas where informal influence can operate. Meghan's historical strength has been visibility and narrative momentum, but visibility without institutional reinforcement becomes isolated, and narrative without response risks echoing into silence. The emotional layer cannot be ignored either, because shock has a way of hardening into resolve or dissolving into recalibration, and sources suggest that within Meghan's inner circle there is intense debate about the next move, whether to maintain composure and allow time to soften the edges of finality or to reassert presence in a way that demands acknowledgement. Yet the risk of reassertion is greater now than before because the palace's emergency alignment means any overt escalation could be framed as disruption rather than defense. That is the trap of structural finality. It narrows options without appearing to do so. What makes this saga so chilling is that nothing explosive has happened in public view since the statement, and yet everything feels different. That difference is not measured in headlines, but in absence. Absence of invitation, absence of engagement, absence of informal warmth that once allowed for ambiguity. The emergency meeting was the pivot point, the moment when Catherine's words transitioned from personal declaration to institutional stance. And once an institution adopts a stance, reversing it requires more than apology or reconciliation. It requires a compelling reason to reopen what was deliberately sealed. Speculation now swirls about whether this marks the definitive chapter break or merely the beginning of a colder, more strategic era of distance, because distance, when maintained calmly, becomes normalized over time. What begins as shock becomes expectation. What feels abrupt becomes routine, and routine in royal systems solidifies into tradition faster than anyone anticipates. If Catherine's statement signaled the end of a conversation, the emergency meeting may have signaled the beginning of a new structure entirely, one in which emotional volatility is not confronted but quietly bypassed, one in which stability is elevated not as reaction but as identity. The deeper controversy lies in whether this consolidation was inevitable or accelerated by necessity, because if accelerated, it suggests that the palace saw risk and ambiguity and chose to eliminate it swiftly, and if inevitable, then the statement merely exposed a trajectory already in motion. Either way, Meghan being caught off guard underscores a critical miscalculation, the belief that silence equals hesitation rather than preparation. Catherine's silence, now reinforced by structural backing, reads less like retreat and more like endurance refined into power. As weeks unfold, the world will not witness dramatic showdowns or explosive confrontations. Instead, it will observe subtle confirmations: who stands beside whom at key moments, whose projects receive visible endorsement, whose presence becomes synonymous with continuity. These confirmations will not shout, they will accumulate. And accumulation is how institutional narratives are rewritten without announcement. The palace emergency meeting may never be officially acknowledged, but its effects are already rumored to be shaping decisions that stretch far beyond this moment. For Meghan, the path forward is now lined with narrower choices and heavier consequences, because when an institution aligns decisively, challenging it risks reinforcing its unity. For Catherine, the aftermath is quieter but formidable. Her composure now inseparable from authority. Her restraint reframed as strength that required no amplification. The most controversial truth of all is that the real power move was not the statement itself, but the meeting that followed it. That meeting transformed a personal boundary into a protected perimeter, and perimeters, once guarded, are rarely dismantled without profound change. What began as a measured declaration has evolved into a structural shift that may define the next next chapter of royal dynamics for years to come. No fireworks, no spectacle, no dramatic showdown, just a calm room, a consensus, and a future quietly redirected.